Hi everyone, it's Wojtek here. Let's give other people a minute and then we'll start. Nice to have you here. Oh, I'll just go for a cup of water. Forgot that. No, actually, I did not forget. It was on my desk just on the other side. It's been a long day. Okay. How are you all doing? Okay, I think it's time to begin. So thank you very much for coming here. My name is Wojtek Kutyla, and I'm writing a blog under the name of UX Booster. And this webinar today is the fourth, I think, installment. Fourth? Yeah. No, it's the third installment in the 5-part series. Yeah. And it's to do with UX and design. So some of these things that are the most exciting about user experience design, interfaces and working with things that make us click on other things. Thank you for all the constructive comments about the last webinar. I'm always trying to make things slightly better. So you'll see a few changes throughout this session. But in general, it's going to follow the same format of my talk for maybe 45 minutes and then half an hour of questions and answers. So feel free to think of questions and just type them in as we go. I might be answering them on the fly, or if they are quite complex, I'll answer them at the end. But in general, I'll do my best to answer them all. Okay, I think that's that. Of course, the webinar will be recorded. So if for whichever reason you have to leave early, don't worry, you won't lose anything. You can just come back to this address on YouTube anytime, and that's gonna hold the archive for you. So before we go into details of how UX designers work with interfaces, I wanted to tell you a little bit about what are we going to talk about today. So first of all, we need to clarify some little things. We need to make the distinction between UX and UI. It's a big thing, and very often it makes people confused. And as UX designers, we will have to understand what's the real difference between these two. Then I'm going to talk about stages of interaction design. So how do we approach UX design, interface design, UI design as designers in order to make things work, because there's a certain number of steps that we need to undertake. There's also going to be a short set of slides on human behavior. We need to understand how humans behave in order to build interfaces that work for them. And there are some certain rules around that. Obviously, the palette here is huge, and I'm not going to tell you absolutely everything in 45 minutes. That would not be possible, but I'll indicate the most important bits, and we can then follow on in future posts, or you can dig more around the internet to understand this thing better. And I also want to show you things that don't work. I have prepared a sort of a list of my personal boo-boos that I see in the internet very often, things that don't work and drive me and other people crazy. And I'll explain why is this the case and what can we do in order to address those problems. Of course, we'll finish with summary and Q&A. So it should be fairly nice and straightforward. Once again, hello to everyone who has joined us over the last few minutes. Yeah, let's go. So yeah, one of the most important things that we need to think about is that difference in between UX and UI. That's crucial, in fact. Very often we think that UX means only buttons and things we can click on and forms and colorful pages and screens of our mobile apps. Practically speaking, that's not it. UX stands for user experience, and that experience encompasses many, many aspects, and one of them is UI, user interface. So we can have the best interface in the world, the most beautiful one, but if it's not really very user-friendly, or its purpose doesn't really give the user any value, nobody's going to use it, nobody's going to click on that. And that is one of the fundamental problems of the internet today, that many UX designers who work in the trade are focused only on the visual aspect of what they create. And that makes it rather sad, since there's so much more to experience than just what is visible in the browser or on the mobile screen. We've discussed before that UX designers often are, or should be, focused on problems that users are trying to solve. But we also need to remember that there's also a context to every interaction, and that context is also framing the approach to how an interface should be made and used. Of course, there's also business. I have been talking about this last time, where we need to decide how does the business actually is influenced by those actions of a person who's using an interface. And as UX designers, we have to keep it all in mind. So when you're going to be practicing interface design as designers, just keep in mind that it's not just about UI, not about the visual quality of what you are going to make. In fact, I tend to say that in our case, and I'm going to refer to that later as well, it's mostly about function and not the form. The form can be decided later, whether something's green or yellow, that's secondary. Whether something, in the right side of a page, or whether it's, in the middle of the page, okay, that's important. But what's more important is that it actually fulfills the user goals. And we need to remember as well that in order to create a good interface, we can't really work in isolation. That isolation would only bring trouble. So we have to be, once again, focused on working with other people around us. And when it comes to job roles and whatnot, very often you hear of roles such as UI designers or product designers or UX, UI designers. All of that really means that there are people there who produce interfaces that are used by other individuals, excuse me, in a way that fulfills their goals and also fulfills business goals. So that's the basic stuff first. It's really important, as I said, to remember UX is not just UI. There's more to it. Maybe I should hint at one other thing here. Very often when you look for jobs, you see ads that say UX/UI, or they basically communicate that it's really interface design job that you're going to be applying for. And the reason for that very often is relatively low UX maturity within the organization, and organizations that don't understand what UX is made of. So keep that in mind as you're looking to not land in any kind of situation you wouldn't want to be in. It's something to have an eye for, certainly, as it's a plug generally. It's something that the industry has a problem with, and has had a problem with for a very long time. It's going to change eventually, because more and more organizations mature into understanding that user experience is built out of many aspects, but so far that's what we have. So we need to be aware of that and vigilant. Okay, so let's talk now about stages of interaction design, because we know we have designers, we know we want to create something, but how do these designers actually make all these shiny super duper things? It all usually begins with the output of the discovery phase. Discovery phase is something we've been discussing in past webinars, and those are the activities that surface requirements for a product. So those requirements basically come to us through research. When we know what the customers want and we know what the business wants, we are able to somewhat visualize it, somewhat show it, or construct a solution that would answer both ends of this rope, I would say, or whatever we call it, for both parties basically. So the users are satisfied and the business gets what it wants. And I wanted to run it by an example for you, so just to make it easy, so you understand how really it is when we work with something that's practical and real, and not just some theoretical problem. So imagine that in the context of research, or through the means of research, you have gathered the evidence for a user need of a specific type, and that user need says that as a logged in user, I want to change my email address so I no longer receive email to my old mailbox. So you essentially have your customers wanting to change their email addresses because maybe once in a while they change their email address, or maybe the other one becomes spammed, or whatever happens, and they want a new one. And we need to be able to give them that opportunity to change those addresses. The business need that relates to that is that we want users to keep their email addresses up to date in our system, so our communication isn't marked as spam when it bounces, because if an email address becomes inactive, then an email sent to that address can bounce, and then the spam bots can, obviously spam machines, spam detectors can mark it inappropriately and cause all sorts of trouble. That might be just an example, but this could be or might be one of a real user and business needs that you might need to address. And when you're looking at something like this, each one of those user needs is sort of a gold mine for functionality. Like, it kind of shows you what you really want to do. Clearly here we need a number of elements. We want an option to display the current email address, obviously, to make sure that user knows what their current email address is. We want an option to specify a new one, so that would most likely be a sort of a form, a text box. And we need a call to action, a button to save that new address. But is this really all? When you're looking at something like this, you should start developing this understanding that there's more to it. And for instance, here you could easily think of a confirmation of sorts that yes, your email has been changed. And now what happens with something like this? Well, obviously we need to attack it somehow with the visual design, with the interface. And so we want to start visualizing this as soon as possible to make sure that when new things are added or changed, we have already a thing to work from. So the first thing to do would be to prepare a small sketch, and you can do that on paper or on anything else that would allow you to draw, like an iPad. I've made this on my iPad, and this is something I would normally make either electronically or on paper. And that's just the visualization of that thing from the past slide. So we have some sort of a title here, we have the current email, and we have a space for new email and a save button and a thank you message that appears when that email is changed. Now think about it this way. It might look actually scruffy as hell, and it's not really even that, visually stunning or anything at all. But something like this is a visualization of the idea you've had in your head, and that's very important. As long as it stays in your head, it's useless. Here on paper, it can actually be shown to people. You can run this past your colleagues. You could even potentially test something like this with users, real world users, and ask them questions like, hey, how does it come across to you? How does it work for you? Is there anything that's unclear here? Is there anything that's clear? And so on. And you can get feedback on something as simple as this. There are some particular good things about it too, other good things. First of all, this is really cheap and quick to make. I mean, you can make 100 of those in a day. I've made this in maybe 2 minutes, including the export time. So that's really, really quick. And it doesn't require you to use any special skills. I mean, granted, I've used an iPad for this, but I often do it on paper. And in fact, I would normally do something like this on paper. It's just because I had to have it in my slides here, I chose an iPad for that particular situation. You can make as many iterations as possible. You can have your colleagues sketching with you. All sorts of things can happen here. And that's a very good method of just like, spitting out stuff that you have in your head, basically putting it in some visual form, into some visual form, so that could later be transformed into something more. Now, sketches like this are what UX designers do all the time. We sketch absolutely all the time. I mean, if you looked into any of our notepads, you would see that, there's plenty of crazy drawings of little and bigger things. And that's one of the abilities that you'll have to develop to be able to work effectively as UX designer. There are many ways of doing that. You can, for instance, sketch things from your memory. So like think of, a shopping cart solution and see if you can sketch it out without looking at your computer. Or you can look at something that already exists and even try sketching that for starters, even looking at it, just, taking it into paper form. So you practice just simple drawing. And as you can see, it doesn't have to be of any special quality. As long as you are able to read what's there and see what controls you have, you're absolutely fine. Of course, all of this is really important and works, but only if we understand the preferred way of how users would want to do something first. So on the back of your head, please do keep all this information about discovery and finding user needs. I mean, creating stuff like this out of the blue might work for you, but might also end in some trouble when you build things that nobody wants to use. Generally, though, when you have something like this and you've made a number of iterations and you are now able to take it further, The next step from there would be something that we call a wireframe. But before I show you a wireframe, I want to show you another example of a real world sketch. And that's something that the students of one of my workshops have created. That's just a number of iterations of a different approach to application interface. So, as you can see, it's really easy to brainstorm ideas like that, and that can later be made into something much better. So I said about sketching, I explained what sketching is. This is wireframing. Those are wireframes. Now, what you can see here, these wireframes are virtually the same things, they show you the same things as the sketch would, but what's really cool here is that they are made in a computer, and they do look like computer interfaces after all. You have, labels, you have the form, you have a button, you have all these things that you would expect to see on the screen. This is pretty scruffy, I give you that. There isn't really much, roundedness around things. There's not much color here, and it's really quite basic. But this you could certainly show to others, and you could even test that quite easily with the real person. You can show them that, and that's way more convenient than showing them paper. You could do it in a computerized setting, so to speak, so on a computer desktop or on your mobile. For this, I've actually used a piece of software called Adobe XD, which I'm going to talk about later on a little bit. Doesn't really matter. I'll talk about software in general. But what I want to say is that there's so many ways of creating this that you can choose the way you like. A wireframe like that would be very simple. You just want to show the basic structure of how interactions work. So you don't need to go into, branding. You don't need to go into logos, high-end, high-definition images or videos. This is just to illustrate how a person can make a progress from one screen to the other and what would sequentially happen on their journey. Wireframes are actually my favorite way of testing anything because they're very, very easy to make, very fast to make, but they do actually work kind of like the real thing would. So that's really, really helpful in making progress, in moving forward in your product development. Now I'm going to show you another example of wireframes. These are from Wikipedia. And as you can see, they are also quite scruffy, but you can recognize that there are things on them that actually would make this work. There's a little video and some gallery and some lists and paragraphs and tables. And that's what you want from your wireframe. You want that clarity to be able to show to the person who's looking at them what's the purpose of the solution and how it could be used. Just that. Now, the next stage from there, when you have wireframes, is to create something that works, that you can link, that you can, move from one page to the other. And for that, we use prototyping. Prototypes can often be more dynamic. They can show some little pieces of functionality. They can update in real time. They can react to clicks. They can draw the real data from a database. Very often when prototypes are made, they are not only made by UX designers, but by our colleagues from front-end development department, or generally by developers, because there might be some programming needed to make them work. And such prototypes are probably the most finite way of testing solutions that we want to put in front of real people. Now, I'm going to talk about usability testing in the next webinar and how do we do that. But in general, this is to do with showing things to our target users and asking them questions related to the ease of use and observing their behavior. You can do that with wireframes, of course. You can even do that with those paper sketches, but prototypes are often the best for that because they put a stronger emphasis on the context of where the user is at or the participant in testing is at. So that allows them to look at things like branding, coloring, and many other aspects of a service that otherwise would not be visible on a wireframe. Now, this is another screenshot from a connected prototype where you can see some little colors, you can see some, a little bit more of interaction going on in between screens. Those gray lines are how clicks go from one to the other. And that's essentially what you want to prepare. You want to be able to cover your entire user journey with screens that people can click through and navigate through your prototype. Very often when we say prototype, we mean wireframe. When we say wireframe, we mean prototype. You'll see that a lot in the industry. Frankly, it doesn't really matter what you call it. It's some sort of a product mockup that can be made interactive in order to be tested. That's what's really important. And the level of fidelity you choose depending on what do you want to do. If you just want to do a super quick test with someone, draw it on paper, don't worry about it. If you want to do something deeper, if you want to gain more deeper insight, you can prepare something more refined. If you have a customer that's pushing you for the branding and whatnot, and they really are adamant that you have to have it on your prototype or your wireframe, just do it, and that's okay. Context frames everything. It only depends on your time, your budget, and what you want to achieve. Now, what I wanted to talk about very briefly are tools. There's so many tools nowadays to create prototypes because, that's kind of sexy when you see things moving, like, page elements and forms and other clickable things and animations. So there's plenty of software companies that provide us with lots of programs for making wireframes and prototypes. And some of the most popular ones are Figma, Sketch, Adobe XD, but there are many, many others. In my old era, when basically, I don't know, we didn't really have Netflix or internet, working the way it does today. We had Axure, which is still sometimes used mainly by large organizations, and it's actually quite an involved software. But there's plenty other packages that you can use to visualize your requirements, your ideas. What really is very important to remember here, that you should choose the tool that works for you. And I very often get questions from junior UX designers or people who want to embark on this UX career, that they don't really know which tool to learn, and they are afraid that there are so many tools, they don't know which tool to choose, and some of them are free, most of them have some sort of free versions, but you also need to pay for more functionality. So why would you pay for so many if you can choose one and whatnot? And I always say, choose something that you like, try a couple of them for free, choose the one that you like and stick to it. You will most likely throughout your career have to change it anyway, because you'll go into a different organization and there'll be a different, wider context basically of what the team is using, and somewhere they'll be still on Axure, somewhere else they would be using InVision with Sketch, and elsewhere there would be Figma, and yet you go to another company next year and they will tell you, no, it's only Adobe XD with us because we use the Adobe Creative Suite, and that's just that. So don't stress over it. If you know the basics of how to wireframe things and how to prototype things properly, how to put a couple of boxes on a page and make it look and work like a page, like a website or like a mobile screen, you can do it with any of those tools. And it's not that one is better than the other in everything. There are certain aspects of Figma, for instance, that are absolutely fantastic, and certain things that aren't great. There are fantastic things about Sketch and great things about Adobe XD and great things about Axure, but also all of these packages actually suck in some way. So just take it easy, choose something you like, get into that mindset of common sense, and basically start from sketches and see what works for you. On this list, there's Pencil. Pencil is free forever, and you can use that. So, that might be your first choice. But seriously, just do what works best for you. Now, with all these tools, you can not only wireframe, but you can prototype. Like, you can make things interactive. To some extent, it's easier with some than with the others, but generally it's actually possible to make things work, to flow from one screen to the other. So what's the framework for that? Just once again, to have it all on one screen, we start with the ideation. We basically sketch everything we can on paper or in any other form, and we iterate quickly, because the way here is to find the best option. Now remember that what happens first, what you come up with first, isn't always the best option. Very often we have this where we look at a piece of paper and go like, yes, that's just that, and that's the only thing we've made, but it's like so amazing. It might not be. In fact, very rarely it is. So keep going on, keep checking, keep going until you find an iteration that you think works, and then you might be ready to wireframe it. So make it slightly more polished, but still keep it very low level, so you can discard it any minute and start from scratch and make it better. This is really important, because I remember I've seen many times situations in which designers were building beautiful prototypes just to get totally crushed and disillusioned by, let's say, usability testing or stakeholders that were saying, this is just what we don't want, totally doesn't really work, it's pointless. And then you have to go back to the drawing table and make something beautiful again. That's just hard. So work with your customers and your colleagues from the very beginning, from the ideation stage, and keep showing them things as you make them to avoid that total disappointment. Once you have your wireframes and you've tested them somehow with people, even if those are just your colleagues in your own department, if there's no other option, that's better than nothing, then prototype it. You can make it more interactive, you can make it more beautiful, you can make it more real world like to show it to people. And then you test. And that testing and refinement happens in a circle. This really is something that you should be doing all the time. You need to be able to highlight ideas for improvement, areas for improvement. You need to be able to understand where your things don't work so you can make changes in the next iteration. And that's really important. Now, what happens in many organizations, and you might find that in your career, is that you'll be skipping stages. So you won't be sketching on paper. You won't be wireframing. You'll be going directly to prototyping. And if that works at your organization or for your client, that's excellent. If you don't have time, do that. However, keep in mind that if you have something that's really high fidelity, it's harder to change it. So it's better to develop a very simple solution at the beginning, test it at the beginning, throughout, so you know it has the solid background, solid foundation, and then only make it into something more refined as you know that those requirements, initial requirements, were met. That's really, really important. Now, one thing that I wouldn't be skipping from this is testing, but of course, guess what happens? I mean, many places that I've worked in before, many places that I know of today, skip the testing entirely until the last stage after prototyping, where the product is really well kind of polished, and that is often met with a little bit of disappointment after the actual testing. Once again, as I said, you might need to come back to the drawing table, and that can drive you nuts, really. So yeah, as I said, testing should happen as often as possible. And you can be testing your little sketches, your little pieces of work all the time. What I do when I'm drawing things, I'm showing them to all my colleagues in the team, or even to other people that I know, just to kind of get the second eye on it. I mean, you can even now, working from home, you can ask your partner or your colleague or your flatmate that you live with for a quick opinion on something, just to see how they behave using that little piece of interface you made. Even if you do it in a way that doesn't really tell them the whole context of the story, it's still something. Do it so you are sure that what you do makes sense before you take it to the further stage. That's really that when it comes to wireframing and prototyping. If you have any questions related to that, just put them into the chat and I'll answer them at the end of the session. What I want to do now is to talk about a couple of in fact, a number of concepts that are really important that we need to understand as designers before we go into building interfaces, and they are related to human behavior, which, as you know, is a tricky bit altogether. So the first concept that you need to understand as interface designers and UX designers too is the concept of cognitive load. Now, the way I tend to explain it is that each one of us has a little battery inside. And when you are waking up in the morning, that battery is full and you can do all these cool things. And then, yes, of course, many people say, oh, in the morning, I can't do anything. Okay, I give you that. Maybe your battery has a strange charging cycle, but still there's a point in a day where you are at your peak. You can do anything. You can write a difficult email, you can work on a difficult project, you can have a difficult conversation with either your colleague or maybe, somebody in your family if you have to. I mean, you can go through things like knife through butter, essentially. But as you go throughout the day, that battery goes down and down and down. And then you basically feel less and less powerful. And at the end of the day, you can even look at your partner when you come back home, or your kids, and they talk to you and you just see faces moving and you don't really recognize sounds. I'm sure you've all had that, right? So that's called, that's called our cognitive load. And what is really important to remember is that whatever we want people to do in the internet with digital solutions that we produce makes an impact on this cognitive ability. it hits the cognitive load. So more and more tiring things make our users less able to do things that we want them to do. If you think about it, for instance, in terms of shopping experiences, notice what happens at the beginning of those experiences when you're choosing, an item from a store, be it a pair of shoes or I don't know, a CD if you're still buying those, for instance, or a book. That's the hardest part of the shopping experience. You have to compare things. You know what it's like. It's really difficult to compare gadgets online and other things that we buy. And that's the most time consuming and it drains your resources. But later on, you go into the purchase process, and purchase processes, as much as they are, of course, difficult because we make important decisions, are actually quite easy in a way that they are pretty much automated. You go through screens from one to the other, address, payment, shipping, boom, done. You can do it almost on autopilot. You know your address. You don't have to worry about that. That first choice, which is the most important, to do with the price, you take at the beginning anyway. So those are companies thinking about making this easier for us, right? And as UX designers, you would have to do that as well. Always think of the ways of making it easier for users at the end. Not to make them stupid, but just to recognize the fact that we don't really want to be doing anything difficult. And if you think you are unique and you love doing something difficult, and that's just what's powering you up, and you like the whole day of just doing difficult things, then do that for a couple of days and notice what your brain is like at the end. You will need a break, right? And in fact, you're not different at all from any other human being in the same situation. When we deal with difficult things, we need to recharge. So cognitive load is one of the most important aspects that we need to take into consideration when designing interfaces. Everything needs to be easy to use, intuitive, and not take too much of our brain resource. Now, the next thing on that list are mental models. Mental models are sometimes quite difficult to understand, but to be honest, it's actually super simple. In the real world, we do things in a certain fashion. When you make yourself a coffee, you know what framework you follow. You basically go to your kitchen, you take the coffee out, then you put your AeroPress on or your coffee machine or whatever it is that you have, pour some water in, boom, you have a coffee after a minute, maybe add some milk or you heat it. There's a method for it, like a recipe. This is a mental model. This is something we follow. Or if you go to work, you go for a bus, you stand and wait in a queue, then the bus comes, then you pay the fare, then you go. All these things are somewhat natural to us. We are not really thinking about them. We're just doing them. Now, if you take that into the internet, you'll notice that most experiences that you know that are really good are actually following these real world mental models. I mean, think of Netflix, right? Netflix is a service that shows you movies online, really, but it's not very different from that experience of going to an old school Blockbusters, if you still remember them, or like a DVD rental store if you live in a country where there were no Blockbusters, and just renting DVDs or even VHS if you're that old, just like me, you know, and bringing that home and watching it. That's essentially the same experience, just taken into online. You go through shelves of movies, you pick the one you like, and it is on your screen. If you think of Spotify, that's not very different from browsing through your CDs and playing them on your CD player. It's just that, it's an endless stream of music available to you at any time. So those mental models are something that we have to think about when we design, and you discover them in pretty much everything. So if you look at booking holidays, if you look at buying books, and even if you look at things like online dating, there are certain mental models that this follows. You want to meet someone, understand them first, have a nice conversation, then maybe you'll go out together to have a nice date with them, or or just meet them for a beer or whatever it is. So there's a mental model underneath pretty much everything you see in the internet, and the same applies to interfaces. They should have clear, distinct steps that are following the mental model that you want to serve. This way you can ensure that it would work for the end user. And the final thing you need to remember, well, actually one of two final things, are affordances. The way to understand affordance is very simple. Things that we click on, that we drag, that we type into, that we just interact with in the internet look like things that we could interact with. So the click me button that you see on screen here looks like a button. I mean, sort of, right? It's my hand drawing, but you can recognize it as a button. And that immediately comes to mind because it has a bevel, it has a label, and it looks like a button. The same with a drop down. It has that little arrow on the side, and there's something you can choose, and you know that would be a drop down. And the list has those little dots, and that tells you that there's a list of items. So when you're building interfaces, it's really important to remember that. And very often we will be choosing elements of interaction design, like buttons and drop downs and text fields and links, and we need to make sure that they look like something that would remind the user of the purpose of that thing. If we manage to do that, then that affordance is met, and it's okay and it works. If we don't do that, well, that's where we go into trouble. So as designers, we have to make things look like things that our users would be familiar with. And that takes me to the fourth point here, which is to do with familiar patterns. In everything that we do, we have mental models, but we also have familiar patterns. So if you close your eyes for a second, and if I ask you to imagine what would a car rental company show you on their website, you would immediately kind of know what to expect, right? There'd be a number of boxes to click on, there'd be a number of cars to choose from, and maybe a place where you're picking it from, and a place where you are gonna return it after you hire. And this is very easy for you to imagine because this is a familiar pattern you've seen many, many times. Another familiar pattern may be, for instance, what you see on Spotify. Okay, it fits the mental model of your CD player and CDs, but there's that pattern as well of, the big button in the middle with a triangle on it. You can play and pause, then it changes into those two vertical bars. And you have triangles with vertical bars on the side, so you can go from one song to the other. And these things are very common to us. If you are designing a music player, regardless of what sort of flow would that be based on, whether you're choosing CDs or some other files or some other streams or whatever it is, you would most likely need a play button. And the play button, the first one that would come to your mind would be the one with the triangle. That's just because you see it everywhere. And it's actually proven that people like us, we just like clicking or like interacting with things that are familiar to us. That really does help big time. So these four things: cognitive load, affordances, familiar patterns, and mental models are very, very important, and you need to keep them here in your mind as you design at all times. The good thing about them is that actually they do come to us rather intuitively, and once you start breaking those rules, you start noticing that something isn't right. Like if you were to come up with a new control for a screen interaction, new way of swiping or clicking or tapping, or even a new control that you haven't seen before, there would be something not quite right with it, and you would know it with your gut. And that helps a lot. So whenever you design something, whenever you draw something, whenever you make an idea, you have an idea for things, and it doesn't seem to be clicking with you, that's worrying. Have a look at it and see whether it matches to any of those, whether it responds to any of those four things, whether it is actually intuitive enough to use. Now, if you have any more questions around that, once again, please put them into the thing. Thank you, Sabina and Peter. I'm going to answer your questions at the end, obviously, along with the other ones. So let's go into the next stage of what should we keep in mind when designing interfaces. And there's a number of basic rules that can help anyone. Now, the list is almost indefinite. There would be guidances here for mobile apps and for web apps and for software desktop apps and for so many things that are related to many streams of how we design applications. But I wanted to mention a couple of the basic ones to give you that good solid background of what you can explore further. So the first thing is the simplicity, and there's even a rule called keep it simple, stupid keys principle. And that's to do with making things as easy and intuitive as possible. Now, if you think of all the best products you've ever seen in your life, be it that ancient iPod here, or Google, or Netflix, or let's say anything, a fork even, all these things are super, super easy to use. And you can do only one or two things with them and no more. But strangely enough, these are the things that sell the best. They answer a simple need in the simplest possible fashion. The worst products that you can imagine are usually the ones that are answering many needs in one, and they simply don't work as well as they should because complexity rises, and to make it work well when it's complex is very, very difficult. So long story short, whatever you do, just kind of visualize it or have an idea and then take things away. And that's my method actually. When I'm working, I'm kind of creating little visual ideas of interfaces and whatnot, and then I'm looking at them and thinking, okay, what can I throw away, remove, reduct, and then basically I finish with the thing that might work. I mean, obviously you still need to test it, you still need to put it in front of people, but if it's simple enough, then that's a good way of doing it. One of my favorite photographers, Ralph Gibson, you might want to Google the guy, but you don't really have to, has this method, and he's like, a very, experienced photographer now in his 80s, late 80s, and he's been doing photography since his 20s, maybe or earlier, has this method of work where he looks at a scene, whatever it is, a landscape or, a portrait, and he goes closer, approaches the subject closer and closer until there are no other things in the frame than the thing that interests him, and he throws away things from the frame as well, rearranges the space just to make it really striking, really simple, and his photographs are beautiful. And it's the same with design. The best stuff is simple. So don't overcomplicate things. Always ask yourself for a rationale. Do I really want to have that? What's the reason? Who is this helping? If you do that, you'll avoid what we call a feature creep. And the feature creep is a big thing, big nasty thing, where you start putting things into your system that don't make sense for anyone and just make their life difficult. You really want to avoid it at all times. Try sticking to that action of one thing to do per screen. If you think of all the best apps they do one thing only on each of the screens, like Google. On the first screen, you can only type and search. On the other screen, you can only click on the search result. On Google Maps, you can only type your location, or that's pretty much it. The fact that you can scroll them up, that's like a secondary thing. You're going to be going somewhere, and very often you just search. So that's that. One action per screen, and keep it very simple. Now, think of grids. This is the only part of this that's kind of related to visual design, really like very closely graphic design. But if you look around yourself, you'll notice that everything that you see on the computer screen and beyond, actually, even in your world, would be arranged around the grid, around the layer of squares and, things you can divide almost indefinitely. And that's how the internet works. So give everything breathing space. Look at any website like YouTube or The Guardian or BBC or whatever you like, and see how much breathing space they have around elements, how much area there is for design to breathe. Perhaps YouTube isn't actually the best example because it's quite busy, but in general, websites that work well or apps that work well tend to be very clear and clean, and there's plenty of space around design elements that make everything easy to use. Like on this Flickr screen here, where you can actually see that the top part of it is fairly simple. There really isn't much. It's not really that crowded. That helps you use it and makes it into an easy interface. And the next thing that you need to think about is accessibility and inclusion. Now, when you work as designers, you need to build things that work for everyone, regardless of who they are, where they live, what's their socioeconomic status, what kind of devices they use for accessing the internet. And the easy way to do that is to think that you simply don't want to alienate anyone, and you want to give everyone an access to information that they really require. Simple things you can do without going into a lot of detail. Most of all, make everything clear and easy to understand, easy to read. Keep the size of the text right, and make sure that you can actually enlarge it with your browser controls. Keep the contrast right. Avoid low contrast. I'm going to show you an example of that later on when I'm going to be talking about things that don't work. Allow choices. Make sure that you can actually do things in a way that's the most appropriate to everyone who's using your website. So if somebody needs, a text equivalent of a graphic image, give them the text equivalent. If they need audio description of something, give it to them. They have a screen reader, they might be able to use it. And if you want to know more about this, refer to WCAG, WCAG, Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. But in general, the best way to look at it is build what you want to build and give it to someone who can see too well or can't hear too well, and see how they react to it, how they work with it. But also remember about inclusion. Inclusion is how we feel using something. So if you make a gender selection box, remember that having just male and female in there isn't really quite up to standards of nowadays, and you need some other ways of doing that, of compensating for that. In which case, the best would be just to provide a text box so the person can describe what they would like to be referred to as, right? So doing this would make sure that actually what you do is accessible to as many people as you can. Once again, any questions about that, just put them in. Plan your information architecture. Information architecture might be a tricky thing to understand, but actually it's very simple in the way that it only is to do with where things go. Where is the content being looked for and whether people can find it there? If you're building a website, think of the sitemap and how paragraphs are laid out on the page and what comes first. If you're thinking of a mobile app, just think of particular screens and see how they align with each other and how they are connected. Information architecture, you have to plan ahead of building your interface. You can make it on the go as you work, but that's going to make your life a little bit more difficult. Remember about hierarchy, remember about clarity of information, and you're going to be absolutely fine here. And label elements clearly. You see some buttons and you see some text in here. A button with the label of submit doesn't actually mean anything. You don't know what the action is going to be at the end, yet you see that button everywhere. The submit button is everywhere, literally. It doesn't mean a thing. A button with the label of save, stop, cancel, delete, those are good labels. When it comes to text, you see the click here link everywhere in the internet, but click here doesn't mean anything out of the context. Make it into something meaningful, like here. Wojtek's recipes for pancakes can be read here, that doesn't work. Read Wojtek's pancake recipes, that's so much better. If somebody's using an assistive technology, that will be read out to them as a link. If this is Google looking at your site, it will know where the link takes it. So, labeling, again, very intuitive. Just make sure that whatever you have in there actually serves a proper purpose. And then, as I said earlier, if you're not a graphic designer, if you are, excellent. But if you're not a graphic designer, don't try to be. You'll see that many interfaces are created with a beautiful fidelity, but these are things that are polished up by graphic designers and product designers, people who can really make it work. As a UX designer, you don't have to have a degree in graphic design. It does help to understand a bit about composition and color and typography, but you really don't have to be an expert. You need to create functional things that later can be improved by other of your colleagues. So don't worry about it and focus on the on the function, not on the form. Focus on the function so you can actually create things that work for people. Now, this is pretty much the end, but I wanted to show you a couple of things that don't really work, and those are some of my favorite examples that I see everywhere, unfortunately. So let's go into my subjective list of things that suck. So one thing, low contrast and hard to read text. I see it everywhere. This actually is my mailing system that you receive all your emails from me from. And that's a very good system on its own. I really like it, but it's very hard to use it for me. I don't see that well without my glasses, and even with my glasses, it's a bit of a struggle at times, and I can't read it. There's so much gray text and everything is tiny. This isn't good. So essentially, you want to avoid those situations. So use things like contrast checkers or Adobe Color Wheel to just find out colors that work for you and the combinations that are actually making it easy to understand. Low contrast is one of the most common things I see in the internet, and it's really, really annoying. So try avoiding that. It's inaccessible and it makes things unusable for users with even good vision. Now, the other thing is endless scrolling. If you notice what Instagram has done some time ago, they have introduced that function where after you scroll for a while, it tells you you're up to date. Now, they did it mostly to stop people from binging the content for hours, which is, not a great way of interacting with the service, but also because a scrolling without the end actually introduces a number of very big problems. It is addictive. It doesn't really inform the user on whether they are at the end of the story or the article or a set of images. It makes it difficult. Why is it there? Well, it's been invented because it can hold people longer on what is designed for them. But as designers, you have to remember about ethics and remember about accessibility and try avoiding such solutions. Why is this inaccessible? Well, screen readers, for instance, that are reading the text out to people who can see, they are dependent on the copy of the page being loaded fully. So before they kick in, they need that copy. Now here, you never know when it's full or not. So, endless scrolling doesn't really work too well. Just keep that in mind. Always provide the notion of ending to every experience that you have. That's really important. Okay, so the next thing is only one screen orientation. That's my Spotify. Many people use their phones in that horizontal orientation, and that's really not that uncommon. You'll see it everywhere. You can watch a movie, you can reply to your email like this. The keyboard is bigger, it's more handy, and of course, many individuals who require a little bit more help with using digital interfaces, for instance, they have problems with their limbs, they might use it like that. And we see this everywhere, that interfaces don't rotate. That's one of the common problems of mobile. Avoid that. Make sure that you design everything for two orientations and that it could be used in the orientation that's chosen by the person who's using your device. Essentially, you want to make sure that people have choice in methods of interacting with software that you're building. And yet another thing is long and strange password rules. Obviously, the message on the left is legendary by now. It's basically something from Microsoft Office, an older version of it, and it's brutal. Your password needs to have this and that many characters, and it's just crazy. You can't really have that. On the right, though, you have a beautiful screenshot from Dropbox where they say that good passwords are hard to guess. And you can just uncommon words. You can use uncommon words or inside jokes or standard or strange uppercasing, lowercasing, standard phrasing, straight phrasing, whatever it is that makes it easy for you to remember. And that's something that you want to do. Whereas asking users for complicated passwords doesn't really actually make them at all more secure. It only pisses everybody off. And if you've ever typed any of those passwords into anything, you know what I mean. So just keep that in mind. We need to make things easy for people, and building that as a part of an interface journey is really important. And the next thing is, I'm kind of, almost contradicting myself in here, videos and audio playing automatically. This is something that really can upset a lot of people, and I bet that it did upset you at some stage somewhere, where you were maybe sitting at your office and then suddenly a page opened in the background, started playing your video or a song. That's really not great. Always provide the user with the ability to stop it and to essentially start it when they really want to start it themselves. Animated backgrounds and such things, maybe they're cool, visually, but practically speaking, they're only annoying to people. So just avoid that like a plague, and don't do it. Don't do what I just did on that slide to illustrate that it's happening here, right? It's very important for videos and audio to be played on demand and stopped on demand. And then too much stuff on one screen. I mean, look at this. This is an example from some mega menu. How much content you have here on just one menu, navigation menu. It would be hard to choose things. It would be hard to use it. So make sure that you have one primary function per page, as I explained, and there's not more, and you allow the user to actually use just what they would need. So think of the questions now. I'm going to have to, I have a couple of here, so I'm going to answer them, but if there's more, just put them in. I just wanted to give you a super quick summary before we go into questions. First of all, just start from the ground up. Start from the easiest way of looking at things. Sketch, then wireframe, then prototype, or do a combination of those, but make sure that it's iterative and you can change it very often and test it often. Keep things simple and clear, and make sure that everything is accessible and inclusive. And I know there's an answer here from Peter on what's accessibility and inclusivity, what are the two differences. I'll explain that in a minute, but in general, just keep in mind that you need to focus on making your products work for absolutely everyone. Avoid some common mistakes. Remember those basic interface design principles and dig for more. There's plenty more available in the web, and I'm going to be referring to them on UX Booster throughout what I publish there. So you're going to learn more. But in general, just make sure that you basically don't design any sort of revolutionary weird things that nobody would want to use at first. Stick to common interface patterns and you're going to be just fine. And if you can, the final advice is explore some graphic design, visual design training. Udemy, for instance, is full of those courses you can purchase. We can purchase for just a few dollars, or you can look on YouTube. Most basic things about composition, color theory, typography would really help you a lot. Okay, let's go into the questions. So there's a few things in here. So Peter asked, at which point do you think content design and content writing should come into play? Uh, Definitely as early as possible. I mean, obviously, in the ideal situation, you probably have the content before you start designing the visual assets because you know what your product is trying to communicate. You might not have the full content, of course, because a lot depends on interactions you're going to make. But in general, you would have the most important basics. So, yeah, ideally, that should start as early as possible. Practically speaking, it's very rarely done as early as possible and is done later at the stage of wireframing or even prototyping or even after that. That's the sad reality. But if you can strive for making it, making a way with that in there into your sketches, into your wireframes as soon as you can. That's really the best advice I can give you on that. Now we have something here from Sabina. How does the wireframe and prototype link to an MVP? What are the main differences? Very good question. Thank you for that. So MVP stands for minimum viable product. Minimum viable product means a product that is made on the premise of using the least resource and demonstrating the most value within that resource allocation we have, right? We need to remember that MVPs are often problematic because it's not the designers who decide on what's the minimum viable product, but product managers or even superiors. That can be a problem, but that's a chat for another time. What is important to remember is that wireframes and prototypes are two methods that can be used to visualize any MVP. So the connection works in such way that you basically have an MVP in mind, and then considering the context of what you want to learn and who from, and the time and the money and the resource you have, you can decide whether you're going to wireframe it or prototype it before you build it into an MVP that you can give to people. So those stages still remain. You might have an MVP in mind as a product, but you need to sketch it, visualize it somehow, wireframe it, prototype it, test it. That's how it works. Hopefully that answers the question. If not, please tell me and I'll clarify if this isn't clear. Now, what's in here? What's the difference between accessibility and inclusivity? So the best way I can come up with here is actually something I'm going to steal from my friend Paul Ralph, who works as the UN's guide. And he says something very smart. He says, accessibility is how it works. Inclusivity is how I feel using it. And that really sums it up. So accessibility is giving people access to solutions they need. But inclusivity is how do these people feel, whether they feel being included, not excluded as they are using that solution. So actually, to give you an example of that, for instance, a few years ago, Facebook had a massive problem because, well, massive. I mean, it was actually quite massive, but not in numbers, but in scope of what it was referring to. Native Americans who wanted to register on Facebook and had unusual names. I remember one or two, like John Creeping Bear, and there was another one, I think a woman, and her surname was Double Kill or something like that. When they were trying to enter their information into Facebook, Facebook was telling them that this is just not true, not real, that this is, they just, it's a joke basically. And of course, they were very upset about that. So this is where the interface was okay and usable, but the solution wasn't really inclusive because it didn't really allow people to use it in a way that's most appropriate for them. And that's something that we should really avoid. Peter is very active today with another question, and he says that he's never designed an interface from scratch. Is it like I need some specific hands-on training, or can I just experiment with a side project and learn as I go? To be honest, that's exactly what I did, and it did work for me, and it did work for me wonders. So just try as you go. You see so many interfaces every day, Peter, that to be honest, I'd be surprised if you were not able to come up with something that's really sensible in the first few attempts. It's just a normal thing. We see them everywhere. And if you keep it simple, it should just work for you. Getting training helps a lot. I won't lie to you. You can always learn something new, but you can totally start on your own, and you have, I'm sure, all the skills required to make things work. And yet another one from Peter before we go to Catriona, sorry. You might have already answered that considering my first question, but still, can you build your information architecture around content? Yes, absolutely. Your information architecture is built around your content, and your content is built around your information architecture. One goes with the other. So every content should be meaningful and clear. And for that, you need IA. IA, yes, information architecture. We all confuse that all the time, AI with IA, and once you are in the middle of a sentence, they just go like that. But information architecture is essentially linked to content big time, and you can't really separate these two. Now here from Katrina, how do you avoid UI only graphic design jobs disguised as UX jobs? Wow, that's a big one. That's a really interesting question. And the answer is that most often, all that you can do is to look at what the company does and try to find out whether you can actually get to people who work there and ask them some of the questions. You can also ask questions at the interview stage and quickly find out whether what they really want to do is UX or just UI. Ask about their processes, ask about the decision-making process and how real decisions are influenced by user behavior, if they are at all. You would then know, if they say, yeah, we do a lot of research and very often, and what we say in that research actually influences our work, then that makes perfect sense. But if they just say, oh, we don't really do any research, we just need you to put a couple of pixels together, that's clearly a UI job. There is no definite answer to this, and very often, unfortunately, those jobs will be out there and you go for them and you think they are UX jobs, and they will turn out to be just UI jobs because there will be no interest and low maturity within the organization. I've been in such jobs too. You just have to swallow that and then basically find another one. But it's getting better and better and better because companies mature in time. Okay, do we have anything else from anyone here? Let me just check the thing directly. That'll be it for now, probably. But I'll give you another minute. Maybe I'll just go to the end slide. So a thing I wanted to say to you, obviously, other than to thank you for being with me today, is that I'm still trying to find the best formula for those webinars and for everything that I do at UX Booster, and trying to grow the audience a little bit. So if you have any suggestions or any concepts or any problems or anything you want to talk about, just send me emails, find me on LinkedIn or on Twitter or wherever you like, and just communicate, please, because I can only help you if I know what you need. I have my own ideas, obviously, although you are sending some interesting questions from time to time that I'm trying to answer on social media channels. So I'm waiting for anything that you can send me. The next episode of the webinar will be entitled UX and Research, and that'll be to do with usability testing and a couple of other things that we do in order to validate product ideas. So make sure you tune into that. And as I said earlier, this episode here is going to be available for you on this link, and tomorrow I'm going to open it to the public as well, so everyone can enjoy that stream. Hopefully that's been useful in some way. If you found it useful, let me know. If you didn't find it useful, tell me why, so I can make it better for you next time. And I suppose that's me. So unless there are any other questions, let's have a look here. There doesn't seem to be any. I would like to wish you all a great evening, and thank you very much for tuning in. In fact, I'll do that properly. Thank you very much for tuning in and for this wonderful time we spent together. And I hope I'll see you soon enough. Take care. Have a good one.